The moment Tasha K's name got attached to Teyana Taylor and Pierre, the internet didn't just lean in, it held its breath. Because when Tasha says she uncovered something, it's never surface-level gossip. It's always about what people pretended was real, versus what was actually happening when the cameras were off and the doors were closed. According to whispers now racing through private chats and timelines, this wasn't just a relationship that faded. It was a connection that may have been misunderstood from the very beginning. Not fake in the obvious way, but curated. Managed. Presented in a way that served an image rather than reflected the truth. And once Tasha K allegedly started pulling at that thread, the entire love story began to unravel. What fans thought was chemistry now looks calculated to some observers. What once felt like mutual admiration suddenly feels asymmetrical. Insiders claim Tasha didn't just question how they moved, she questioned why. Why the timing never lined up. Why the silence spoke louder than affection. Why the narrative always benefited one side more than the other. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Sources allege that what looked like romance may have been proximity. What felt like passion may have been positioning. And what fans called private love might have been two people standing in the same space for very different reasons. If that's true, then the biggest shock isn't that it ended, it's that people believed it was ever what it was sold as. Tasha K didn't allegedly ask, who cheated? She allegedly asked, was this real at all? And once that question hit the air, every moment people thought they understood suddenly felt staged. From the moment Tasha K allegedly began laying out her timeline, the story stopped feeling like a breakup and started feeling like a construction. According to sources familiar with what she claimed to uncover, this wasn't about hidden cheating or a sudden fallout. It was about intention, or the lack of it, from the very beginning. And that distinction is what made everything so uncomfortable. Insiders say Tasha didn't approach this like a romantic exposé. She approached it like an audit. She allegedly questioned dates, overlap, and access. Who was present when it mattered? Who benefited when the connection was visible? And who disappeared the moment scrutiny followed? The more she examined it, the more the relationship began to look less like love and more like alignment. One of the first things Tasha reportedly highlighted was timing. According to her alleged findings, moments when fans assumed intimacy or deep bonding coincided suspiciously with career pivots, publicity cycles, or shifts in narrative for one or both parties. That doesn't mean affection wasn't there, but it suggests that visibility may have been doing more work than emotion. Sources claim Tasha pointed out how little of the relationship was actually shared compared to how much it was implied. No declarations. No clear milestones. Just enough proximity to spark speculation. Just enough ambiguity to fuel interest. And in the world of celebrity optics, ambiguity can be more powerful than confirmation. Fans, looking back, began noticing it too. Moments once read as private love now looked like strategic silence. Appearances that felt organic now looked curated. The relationship existed more in implication than in action. And that's where Tasha's alleged question landed hardest. If it was real, why did it always feel like it needed to be managed? According to insiders, Tasha suggested that the connection may have meant different things to each person involved. To one, it may have been genuine curiosity or emotional exploration. To the other, it may have been positioning, access to a world, a network, or an image that aligned with a larger goal. If that's true, then the imbalance wasn't malicious, but it was consequential. What made this theory gain traction was how clean the ending appeared. There was no messy fallout. No public grief. No attempts to clarify or reclaim the narrative. The silence after the connection faded felt less like heartbreak and more like completion. As if the purpose had been served and there was nothing left to explain. That kind of quiet exit doesn't automatically mean manipulation, but it raises questions when paired with everything that came before it. Insiders say Tasha, also allegedly examined, who carried the emotional weight publicly once things cooled. Who absorbed speculation. Who faced questions. And who walked away untouched. That imbalance, she suggested, was telling. Because in genuine relationships, fallout is rarely one-sided. When one person walks away clean, while the other is left fielding narratives, it suggests different levels of investment. Teyana Taylor's role, in particular, became the focal point of reassessment. According to sources, Tasha did not accuse Teyana of faking emotion or misleading fans intentionally. Instead, she allegedly implied that Teyana may have been operating from a place of sincerity, assuming the connection had mutual depth, while Aaron's posture remained intentionally undefined. Undefined enough to allow exit without consequence. If true, that reframes the entire dynamic. It suggests that what fans interpreted as mutual privacy may have actually been misalignment. One person protecting something personal. The other protecting flexibility. And flexibility, in celebrity culture, is power. Tasha's alleged commentary also focused on language. How Aaron spoke about relationships in general. How carefully he framed emotion. How often he emphasized discipline, boundaries, and not mixing personal life with public narrative. Those values aren't red flags on their own, but when paired with proximity to a high-profile partner, they can function as insulation. Insiders claim Tasha argued that this insulation allowed Aaron to benefit from association, without ever fully entering the emotional risk of public partnership. No promises to break. No story to defend. Just presence and then absence. The public reaction to this framing was immediate and divided. Some fans pushed back, accusing Tasha of cynicism and reading strategy into normal privacy. Others felt a jolt of recognition. They had sensed something was off, but couldn't name it. The relationship always felt like a concept rather than a lived reality. And once that idea surfaced, it spread quickly. Old clips were re-watched. Body language analyzed. Moments of supposed intimacy scrutinized for warmth or distance. And what people thought they saw wasn't explosive, it was restrained. Carefully so. Tasha's alleged conclusion wasn't that the relationship was fake. It was that it may not have been mutual in the way fans assumed. That one side may have entered with openness while the other entered with caution bordering on calculation. And when those approaches collide, the result isn't drama, it's quiet disappointment. What makes this first phase so destabilizing is that it doesn't rely on scandal. It relies on reinterpretation. On the idea that love can be real to one person and functional to another at the same time. And that when public narratives are built on implication instead of clarity, the audience fills in gaps that may not exist. As this chapter closed, one question lingered louder than any allegation. If this was ever real love, why did it leave so little emotional footprint when it ended? And once that question is asked, it doesn't just challenge a relationship, it challenges the stories we tell ourselves about what intimacy looks like in the spotlight. As Tasha K allegedly pushed deeper, the conversation moved from what it looked like to how it functioned. This was the phase where the relationship stopped being examined as a romance and started being analyzed as a dynamic, one shaped by timing, leverage, and narrative advantage. And once that shift happened, the idea of real love became harder to defend without serious qualifiers. According to insiders familiar with Tasha's claims, the most unsettling discovery wasn't inconsistency, it was consistency. The same pattern repeating at every critical moment. Whenever the relationship appeared to be approaching definition, it retreated into vagueness. Whenever clarity might have been required, distance appeared. And whenever speculation benefited one side more than the other, silence was allowed to do the work. Tasha allegedly pointed out that this wasn't accidental. It was structural. She questioned why the relationship never crossed certain thresholds that typically signal mutual commitment, not public declarations, but private alignment. No shared long-term narrative. No integrated future language. No visible merging of worlds. Just parallel movement close enough to spark interest, but separate enough to dissolve without consequence. Insiders say this is where Pierre's posture came under sharper scrutiny. According to the alleged analysis, maintained what Tasha described as emotional non-commitment masked as discipline. He spoke often about boundaries, focus, and not letting personal life interfere with purpose. Again, not inherently problematic. But when paired with proximity to a high-profile partner like Teyana, those principles functioned as a shield. He could be present without being accountable. Connected without being anchored. That framing unsettled people, because it fit too well. Fans began noticing how often Aaron's narrative emphasized self-containment. How rarely he referenced shared growth or partnership. How easily the relationship could be interpreted as temporary by design. Meanwhile, Teyana's language, in hindsight, appeared warmer, more open, more emotionally available. Not explicit, but directional. Tasha allegedly argued that this imbalance is where the illusion of love often forms. When one person experiences connection as possibility, while the other experiences it as access. Both can be sincere in their own way, but they're not in the same story. What made this phase explode online was the realization that the ending followed the same pattern as the beginning. No rupture. No grief arc. No attempt to reframe or reclaim. Just a clean fade. And clean fades are rare when real emotional investment exists on both sides. Insiders say Tasha highlighted how quickly the narrative moved on, not just publicly, but energetically. The absence of emotional residue suggested the connection had served its function. Whatever that function was, it didn't require maintenance once it was fulfilled. This is where the question, was this ever real love, gained traction. Not because people wanted scandal, but because they wanted coherence. Love, even private love, leaves fingerprints. It changes posture. It alters language. It complicates exits. This relationship, as re-examined through Tasha's alleged findings, appeared optimized for minimal disruption. Teyana Taylor's position became increasingly sympathetic during this phase. Sources say Tasha did not frame Teyana as manipulative or deceptive. Instead, she allegedly suggested that Teyana may have entered the connection authentically, assuming mutual intent where none had been promised. That assumption, if true, wouldn't be foolish, it would be human. Especially in a moment where Teyana was redefining her own narrative and open to something new. If that's the case, then the heartbreak wasn't public, it was quiet. The kind that doesn't generate drama, but does generate reevaluation. And reevaluation is where resentment often begins, even when no one did anything wrong. The most damaging part of this phase wasn't the suggestion of use, it was the suggestion of asymmetry. One person needing clarity. The other needing flexibility. One person interpreting presence as commitment. The other interpreting it as alignment. Tasha allegedly emphasized that this dynamic is common in celebrity spaces. Relationships aren't always entered for deception, sometimes they're entered for proximity. And proximity can feel like intimacy, until you realize it doesn't require responsibility. Social media reaction during this phase intensified. Not outrage, recognition. Fans shared personal stories of connections that felt real until they weren't. Of partners who benefited from association, without ever fully investing emotionally. Of endings that felt confusing, because nothing technically went wrong. That resonance made the theory harder to dismiss. People began asking whether the relationship had ever been clearly defined by both parties, or whether ambiguity was allowed to persist because it served both until it didn't. And once the benefits shifted, the silence made sense. Tasha's alleged framing didn't condemn. It contextualized. She didn't say Aaron lied. She suggested he never promised what others assumed. An assumption, she argued, is the most dangerous currency in public romance. By the end of this phase, the story had transformed again. It was no longer about exposure. It was about reframing intimacy itself. About recognizing that in high-visibility relationships, emotional reality and public perception often diverge sharply. And when that divergence becomes clear, the question isn't who's at fault. It's why did we believe the version we were shown? Because if love was real to one person and functional to the other, then the betrayal wasn't intentional, it was structural. And structural betrayals don't explode. They dissolve. Quietly. By the time the final phase took shape, the story had moved past exposure and into reckoning, not a reckoning of guilt, but of meaning. The question was no longer whether Tasha K. had uncovered something scandalous. It was whether the relationship people thought they witnessed ever existed in the way they believed it did. And once that doubt settled in, everything else rearranged itself around it. Insiders say this was the point where the illusion of mutuality finally cracked. What Tasha allegedly laid out in this stage wasn't a new timeline or secret messages. It was a reframing of intent. She reportedly suggested that the relationship functioned exactly as designed, not to deceive the public, but to allow two very different agendas to coexist without colliding. One person moved with emotional openness. The other moved with strategic distance. And for a while, that imbalance stayed hidden because it benefited both. Until it didn't. According to sources, Aaron Pierre's ability to exit the situation without visible emotional fallout became the loudest signal of all. Not because emotional restraint is wrong, but because absence of residue tells its own story. Love, even private love, leaves something behind. It changes rhythm. It disrupts focus. It complicates transitions. This connection, as re-examined through Tasha's alleged lens, ended as cleanly as it began. That cleanliness unsettled people. Fans began realizing that what they had invested in wasn't a relationship, it was a projection. A narrative built from implication, not confirmation. From proximity, not partnership. And when that projection collapsed, it didn't reveal a villain. It revealed a misunderstanding. Tasha allegedly argued that misunderstanding is common in celebrity culture. Audiences fill silence with hope. They interpret privacy as depth. They read restraint as romance. And when the story ends without explanation, it feels like betrayal, even if no promise was ever made. That insight reframed everything. Teyana Taylor, in this final phase, emerged not as someone exposed, but as someone misaligned. Insiders say the reassessment softened toward her. People began recognizing that openness doesn't always get reciprocated, especially in environments where emotional availability carries risk. If she assumed mutual intent where there was only mutual benefit, that wasn't manipulation. It was optimism. Aaron, meanwhile, became a symbol of something more complicated. Not a user. Not a liar. But a person who understands how to move through proximity without attachment. How to maintain access without entanglement. How to let others narrate meaning while he preserved optionality. That skill is valuable in certain industries, but when applied to intimacy, it creates confusion that feels like betrayal to the person on the other side. Tasha's alleged conclusion wasn't that the relationship was fake. It was that it was functionally incomplete. One person experienced it as possibility. The other experienced it as alignment. Both could be sincere, but sincerity doesn't equal symmetry. The internet's response during this phase was quieter but deeper. Less outrage. More introspection. People stopped arguing about who was wrong and started talking about how often they'd been in something similar. A connection that felt real because it was close until it wasn't. A situation where silence was mistaken for safety and ambiguity was mistaken for depth. That resonance gave the story staying power. What made this phase definitive was the acceptance that no gotcha moment was coming. No confession. No denial. No clarification. And none was needed. The absence of response became the conclusion. The relationship didn't end dramatically, because it may never have fully begun in the same way for both people. Tasha's alleged role, by this point, wasn't as an exposer, but as a disruptor of assumptions. She didn't prove deception. She questioned interpretation. And that's often more destabilizing than proof. Because when interpretation collapses, the audience has to reckon with its own role in constructing the story. By the end of this stage, the question, was this ever real love, had evolved. The answer wasn't yes or no. It was conditional. It depended on perspective. On expectation. On what each person needed the connection to be. And that's the most uncomfortable truth of all. Some relationships don't end because they fail. They end because they were never the same thing to both people. And once that realization lands, there's no scandal left, only clarity. Not about them. About how easily we confuse visibility with intimacy and silence with depth. And once you see that pattern, it doesn't just change how you view the story, it changes how you view every private love story that unfolds in public. If you've made it to the end, then you already felt the shift. This was never just about who dated who. It was about how easily assumptions turn into stories, and how silence can quietly shape a narrative without anyone ever lying. That's why this conversation matters, and why it doesn't end here. What happens next won't be loud. There won't be a dramatic confirmation or denial. The real answers will show up in patterns, in who keeps moving the same way, who avoids certain questions, and who never needs to explain, because the ambiguity already worked in their favor. Those details are easy to miss if you stop paying attention now. So don't. Like this video, so it doesn't disappear under surface level takes.